introducing our panel folks for tonight. Dr. Stan Sides, a landowner in the area, a caver from going back for several years, and we'll let him tell you more about himself. The guy sitting next to him, I know I probably don't need to tell you, Roger Brucker. Books, a lot about him. He'll tell you more about himself. Next to him is Fred Douglas. Fred is the guy that really has done a lot of the research on Edmund Turner, and I'm not sure if we'd be here tonight at least discussing Edmund Turner if it hadn't been for the input that Fred put in. So, and then sitting next to him is our own local professor, knower of all things that's worth knowing in the cave area. That would be Norman Warnell. So this is your panelist, and again, this is kind of informal. Dr. Sides, I don't know if you want to kick it off, and then I'm sure, Roger, you may have to twist his arm to get him to talk, but he'll probably say something.
Let's start it this way. In 1962, I was a college student in Southeast Missouri State, pre-engineering, and a friend of mine, Barb McLeod, ended up at Antioch College at Yellow Springs, and she and I were caving, surveying caves in Perry County, Missouri, big cave systems, about 4 hours west of here. And we'd read The Caves Beyond over and over, and Barb wrote me from Yellow Springs, and I still have the letter, and the letter said, "Brucker lives!" exclamation point. And she had found that Roger Brucker lived in Yellow Springs, and Roger had written the book, The Caves Beyond. And so I wrote Roger, could I come caving at Crystal Cave? And he wrote me a letter back, so yes, there was an expedition, and it was a New Year's expedition, and so then I didn't have a car, so I wrote him back that I didn't have transportation. I really wanted to come to the caves because Barb McLeod, a famed balladeer of cave songs and such, it was going to be here New Year's. But I had this caving friend, Dennis Drum, and Dennis had a car. Could both of us come? So I still have Roger's letter that says, "Stan, bring Drum to Roger." That's all it said. So with that, in December 1962, we back then used the old hotel. This had been built here. We went out to Flint Ridge, and we were at the Speely Hut, and the back house back behind the Rangers staying up at the old Alston House. And that was my first cave trip. Now, in Missouri, a cave trip, you'd eat till about 9 o'clock. You'd go in the cave till about 4 or 5. You'd come out, you'd have a little beer, and you'd go home. Or you'd eat again. Well, I went out with a guy named Joe Davidson and John Cantwell and Walter Lipton, and we started in the Austin entrance, reading The Caves Beyond, crossing Bottomless Pit. Didn't seem to make any difference. I used a totally different entrance I'd never heard about. With the Austin entrance, we knew nothing about it. And we went, and it was like 8 o'clock at night, and we hadn't gotten to where we were going to survey. Boy, this wasn't the way they did things in Missouri. We were out way out Rouse River Trail. And so we were hooked. We got out like at 3 in the morning, and the next morning at 7, everybody's up and going back in the cave at about 9 o'clock. And then we went to Colossal. Well, we were hooked. Dennis Drum and I were hooked because of Roger. Come forward a bunch of years, and became very interested in the history. My friend Harold Malloy was studying so much of the history here, but Harold emphasized the history of Mammoth Cave up to 1850, but not after. He really was interested in the not so much Stephen Bishop, but the history of Cron and all the early deeds of Mammoth. And what? And the Gatewoods and all the early guides, Miller and such, and the story of these guides. And he wrote the book, Mummies of Mammoth Cave. I was interested in studying history, but I didn't want to step on his toes in the sense of studying a similar thing. So The Park Service, I wrote a proposal to study the people of Flint Ridge and the history of the caves of Flint Ridge. And that's been my project since about 1973, actually. And it's still a Park Service approved project. I became the 4th CRF president. Roger is the 5th CRF president. Back when I was in training at University of Kentucky's medical school. And I'd come down later in the day and we were doing a lot of surveying in Salts. And I'll bring this to a halt here in a second. In Salt's Cave, we're so intrigued by all the Edmund Turner names and dates in Salt's Cave. And many of these, Floyd Collins' name would be right there by them. Usually Edmund had carefully, very precisely noted his name. Floyd only wrote in cursive. Edmund Turner carefully printed these and the date that they were there. So I went through the cave recording names of many others and did a frequency distribution trying to figure out where in the cave did Edmund Turner and Floyd do most of their work. It would seem clear that Edmund Turner must have been surveying Salt's Cave. And the frequency distribution showed it was entirely random. The guys were all over the cave. And they hadn't found the lower levels of Salt's Cave back at that time, by what we knew. So my interest in Edmund Turner began when we started being very puzzled by all of the signatures of Floyd being next to Edmund Turner, or close to it, throughout Salt's Cave. Roger. 5th president of CRF.
I'm Roger Brucker, and I've been involved in 5 different books about Mammoth Cave, primarily about the exploring, but as I got more and more into exploring, I realized one day all of that would be history. And then I began to wonder about the history, particularly about how Floyd Collins could have gotten stuck. And so by the time of the second book, the first book was written in 2 weeks in an attic in Brooklyn, New York, by me, and it has the principal author as Joe Lawrence Jr., and he was the expedition leader into Floyd Collins Crystal Cave in 1954. He took sick and couldn't get off work, he said, and so I ended up ghostwriting his part of that book. He wrote the picture captions. People don't know that. But I thought to myself, this is easy. You can write a book in 2 weeks. You just have a lot of people come in and type, and what you don't know, you make up. One of the things I heard that is the phrase "true if interesting." So if you can write interestingly enough, sooner or later that becomes the truth. So I spent many years exploring, I guess first under the aegis of Bill Austin, and later with Red Watson, Stan Sides, Fred Douglas, and others. I began teaching a course in speleology, which I've taught for, I suppose, 25 years. But lately, these young whippersnappers don't sign up for the course, and so the course doesn't go. Now, Stan's in the same boat. When you get over the hill, it's hard to get people who will follow you. But at any rate, my primary interest was in the current exploration then going on of the Flint Ridge Cave system. We began to find natural connections between Colossal Cave and Salt's Cave, and then Salt's Cave and Unknown Cave, and we earlier had found a connection between Crystal Cave and Unknown Cave, and it seemed inevitable that we were going to connect one of these days to Mammoth Cave, which was a very elusive thing. But eventually, and in 1972, John Wilcox led a trip that actually physically established and surveyed the connection between the caves, making it the longest cave in the world. Well, I remember a couple of days after that happened, Red Watson and I were driving in a car, and he said, you know, we've got to write a book about this, and I knew then we had to. And I said, well, that's okay if I can be the first author, because the other time I wrote the whole book and I was the second author. No vanity here, you know, in historical accuracy. So in writing that, we rented a house in Yellow Springs, set up some long tables like these, brought in some typewriters, had all the books there are on Mammoth Cave, and we were going to write this book. And I thought, I didn't think we could do it in 2 weeks, but I thought, you know, a month ought to do it. Well, at this point, Red Watson said, I've got to go away for 3 weeks. I said, well, I'll start on the history, because all of this makes no sense at all unless you look at the history. Well, history is an odd thing, because there are loose ends on all history. In fact, I discovered that it's kind of like picking up confetti on the floor and putting it together. Some might say it's like a jigsaw puzzle. And after a while, you think you know what's going on, and then after a while, you don't know what's going on. I remember at one point when we had finished writing Trapped, Bob Murray, who was a professor of history at the graduate school at Penn State, and I had collaborated on the book Trapped, and it was a true collaboration. And I said one day, Bob, you know, we worked on this thing for a couple of years, and there's so many questions we've not answered. And he drew himself up to professorial height, and he said, Roger, at this point in time, you and I know more about Floyd Collins than everybody else alive put together. And that seemed to solve my problem. But there are still mysteries that come up. For example, Homer Collins wrote a manuscript describing Floyd Collins. It's printed as a book by the Cave Research Foundation. What a lot of people don't know is that that's the first manuscript of 3. He told the same story a second time and then a third time, and it gets more and more fantastic every time he tells the story. So the Cave Research Foundation elected to print the first one, which is, after all, a first-person account. Murray and I had access to that, so we pretty well strained out of it all the things that looked factual, and left the entertainment parts of it in. Among the other entertainment parts were things such as that Floyd Collins had a romance with a woman who lived on the other side of Flint Ridge over near Great Onyx Cave, and that he used to squire her around to square dances, and then he was really stuck on her. And all of a sudden, she and her family moved to Oklahoma. Tragedy. This would explain his having not much to do with women. Well, another historian and I decided we would track down that rumor, and also the one about Colonel Charles Lindbergh flying the film back to Chicago. So we began digging for a while, and pretty soon he found out that the woman who lived on the other side of Flint Ridge was 67 years old at the time Floyd was about 20. That she disappeared in Oklahoma and never found since. I discovered that Charles A. Lindbergh had never been anywhere near here. He was teaching Army Air Force pilots how to fly down in Texas at the time. And so that urban legend has continued, and of course I've helped continue it by writing about it. Isn't that remarkable? Remarkable. Well, part in writing this history, while Watson was gone for 3 weeks, we put together the Aborigines, we put together T.E. Lee, we came to Edmund Turner. I didn't know much about Edmund Turner, except what Bill Austin had said, that his name was all over Salt's Cave, which told me that Austin had been in Salt's Cave. And we were sure that that was gonna be one of the early caves to connect to Crystal Cave. And he once told me that Edmund Turner, one of Edmund Turner's signature was in a place that led Jack Lehrberger to find the lower levels in Salt's Cave. Now, I don't know the veracity of this. This is a piece of confetti on the floor. We're getting this story. So I wrote what I could readily find about Edmund Turner, that he came from someplace in New York. Now, we have at my left somebody who can correct all these facts. So
Good so far.
this is the way the history comes together. I had him going to Rensselaer Polytechnic in New York, coming here as a result of a failed romance of some sort, taking up boarding at the Collins home because he wanted to learn about caves, and Floyd Collins would take him into Salt's Cave, and that's the signatures you see, and the fact that he neatly printed his name in the cave would be verified by going to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute as an engineer of some capability. And I had one photograph of him that had the dimples of a half-tone dot pattern in it, so it wasn't an original photograph. But that's all I knew about the man, except that he was alleged